You're listening to Barske Studio True Crime. The story you're about to hear is just one of many hidden in the shadows of Nordic history, based on true events. No emotions, no bias, just facts.
Today we're doing something a bit special. We're taking a real shortcut into a piece of World War II history that often gets overlooked.
That's right. We're focusing on just one source, but it's incredibly powerful. It's an article from 2011, and it documents the memories of Svein Heikele, known as Bestefar grandfather in his family.
And this isn't your typical war story about battles or generals. It's about his family's flight from Norway when he was just 6 years old.
A 5-year journey, really. An odyssey of survival as civilian refugees deep inside the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's quite something. Our goal here, our mission if you like, is to pull out the incredible, often very personal details of this journey. Gives you, the listener, a really intimate understanding of Norwegian-Russian relations during the war, but from a ground-level perspective.
Absolutely, because these first-person stories, they show the human costs, don't they? What it actually meant for families, for children, caught between these huge forces, the German occupation on one side, and, well, Soviet wartime reality on the other.
Exactly. And the source itself, it reads more like a conversation than a formal history. Svein Heikele tells his story naturally, starting right at the beginning, in his hometown.
Kiberg, right, a small coastal town in the far, far north of Norway.
Yes, and that location is key. Kiberg is right there on the Barents Sea coast. It actually shares a border with what was then the Soviet Union. So it was incredibly exposed.
So when the Germans rolled in, autumn 1940, everything changed instantly.
Svein was just about to turn 6. And for a kid that age, the arrival of soldiers isn't about politics. It's immediate. It's frightening.
He talks about seeing these black cars, suddenly German soldiers just everywhere. In this tiny fishing village, it must have been completely unsettling.
And it wasn't just the Germans arriving that signaled danger. Source mentions Russian reconnaissance planes were already flying overhead pretty regularly.
Which tells you they were living right on the edge of the Eastern Front, even before things really kicked off there. The Germans were physically present, but the Soviets were literally next door. You can imagine the tension.
Yeah, this whole area felt like it was about to become a battlefield.
And this feeling, this realization, it forced people to make some incredibly tough decisions, life or death decisions, really.
Local families knew what was likely coming. So a group, family members, neighbors, they started having these secret meetings. One was even held in Svein's own home.
Planning to escape, but not south, not inland. That was all German-controlled territory. Their only real option was east, across the water, to Russia, taking their chances there.
Which brings us to the escape itself. Section 1, really. And it sounds like something straight out of a movie script.
Totally. A high-stakes operation, planned in secret, executed on a dark, foggy night, and the consequences of getting caught.
Immediate execution. No questions asked.
The level of detail they went into for secrecy, it just shows the desperation. They used 3 fishing boats. The children, like Svein, were completely wrapped up in blankets.
Carried out silently from their houses onto the boats. You can imagine trying to keep young kids quiet in that situation.
And here's the really clever part, the bit that shows the planning. The engines. They couldn't risk the noise of 3 boat engines alerting the Germans.
So what did they do?
Only the main boat ran its engine, and it towed the other 2 boats silently behind it, across the water, in the fog. They were literally betting everything on that silence, on the fog holding.
Incredible. It really speaks to the community's coordination, doesn't it? This wasn't just a panic run. It was planned.
Highly coordinated. And somehow, against all the odds, the whole group managed to slip out of Kimberg completely undetected by the Germans.
But escaping Norway? That was just the first step. As you said, it didn't mean escaping the war.
Not at all. They landed pretty much directly into the hands of the Soviet military machine. That's the next phase, really. They stopped being Norwegian citizens fleeing and started becoming, well, something else.
Assets, almost.
Yeah.
Soviet assets.
Their arrival on the Rybaki Peninsula, Fiskerhalvøya, the Norwegians called it, was dramatic. Green light flares shot up in front of their boats, out of the darkness.
Must have been terrifying after sailing in complete silence and fog. Blinding, probably.
So the Russians stopped them, took charge. The Norwegians explained, we're refugees seeking asylum from the Germans.
And they were taken ashore. But any hope of sort of gentle processing quickly vanished.
Right. The welcome was pretty harsh. They were put up in a large barracks, but getting there involved this grueling walk, 3 or 4 hours long.
Wow. After crossing the sea in fear.
And then Almost immediately upon arrival, the absolute worst thing happens, certainly for the families.
The separation.
Complete separation of men and women. The men, including Svein's father, the source calls him Oldefar, great-grandfather, were just pulled away instantly.
And Svein says he never saw his father again after that moment, that first day on Russian soil.
And this is where the personal story gives us that crucial political insight. These men weren't just being processed as refugees.
No, they were being conscripted.
Immediately. Sent off to a training camp deeper in Russia, trained to be spies, partisans, they called them.
Yeah. So crossing the border wasn't about finding safety. It was trading German occupation for, well, forced service in the Soviet intelligence network.
Exactly. The Soviets saw them, these Norwegians, who knew the border region, knew the language, knew German movements. They saw them as incredibly valuable assets, not really as refugees needing help.
They were essentially tools for the Soviet war effort, no choice given.
And think about the impact on the families. The men become spies, forced into incredibly dangerous missions back in Norway, while their families are left in this limbo.
It just highlights the complete lack of control they had over their own lives. Their identity became purely military. Svein mentions that bitter irony, doesn't he? Turning 6, fleeing home, and losing his father on the same day, effectively, to the Allied war machine.
That loss, right at the start, it just hangs over the whole rest of the story.
And for the remaining family members, the women, the children, their lives were now completely dictated by Soviet wartime logistics. They couldn't see near the border.
No, too sensitive. So they were pushed further and further inland, trained to Murmansk first.
Then a boat across the White Sea towards Arkhangelsk. The source stresses they are constantly being moved around.
Because the front line was shifting, the war situation was evolving, the Soviets didn't want civilians near anything important, strategically speaking.
Imagine the exhaustion. For the mothers, especially, trying to manage kids, alone, constantly uncertain about where they were going next.
Just relentless uncertainty. Which leads us into the next part, the sheer grind of life on the move, deep inside the Soviet Union during total war.
Eventually, they ended up inland from Arkhangelsk, at a place the Norwegians called Chereville, their name for this first agricultural collective they were sent to.
And the reality of Soviet collective life hit them hard and fast.
The women were put to work immediately in the fields. Spain specifically notes this was really unusual compared to Norway back then. Mandatory farm labor for women wasn't the norm at home.
It's a sign of just how different this world was, a total cultural shift driven by the state's needs.
There were only a couple of Norwegian men left with the main group. The former mayor of Vardø, presumably for some kind of administration.
And a coffin maker, which tells you something about the expected realities of life there.
Grim. They stayed in Chereville for about 3 or 4 months, and then, inevitably,
moved again. The Soviet state's logistics demanded it.
And this next journey was, by all accounts, horrific. A train journey that took a whole month.
30 days, stuck on a train. Why so long?
Because military transport had absolute priority. Troop trains, supply trains. They needed the lines clear. Civilian refugees, they just had to wait. Sidetracked for days on end at stations.
It shows where they stood in the hierarchy, completely secondary.
And being secondary had tragic, fatal consequences. There's a really heartbreaking story from that train journey.
Yes, a little boy, only 2 years old, died.
The train lurched, started suddenly, and he fell, hit his head. The mother was apparently told just to try and keep him awake, but
the injury was too severe. He passed away during that endless transit. It's awful.
a death caused not by enemy bombs, but by the sheer brutal mechanics of wartime logistics and neglect. It just crystallizes how fragile their lives were.
After that awful journey, they finally reached what would become their home for the rest of the war. Another collective farm, this one near Shadrinsk, much further inland.
This collective grew all sorts of things: strawberries, apples, grain, vegetables.
And what's really interesting here is the community. It wasn't just Norwegians and Russians.
No, it was genuinely diverse, a real mix of people displaced by the war.
Svein mentions Jews and Austrians living and working there alongside the Norwegians. And he makes a point of saying, despite everything, there was nothing called racism there.
That's quite profound, isn't it? Shared hardship, maybe breaking down those barriers. The kids all played together, apparently. Equals in scarcity.
But life was governed by that scarcity. They lived communally, likely in a large barn or similar building. Food was strictly rationed: milk, bread, vegetables.
And the collective had to protect those rations. Svein mentions guard towers overlooking the fields.
To stop theft. Because people were hungry, desperate, He says if someone was caught stealing food, there was life in the camp.
Meaning swift, harsh punishment, presumably. Survival meant following the rules, no matter how tough.
Which really sets the scene for the next section, the day-to-day reality, the survival techniques, the extreme conditions of childhood there. It stops being just a refugee story and becomes about pure survival.
Food was everything.
Yeah.
Or rather, the lack of it. Rationing meant everyone had to contribute.
Each family got a small plot of land. They had to grow their own potatoes, their own vegetables, just to supplement the basic rations. It wasn't optional.
And the kids, they worked, no question.
Yeah.
Weeding, harvesting all summer, all autumn. It wasn't childhood as we'd think of it.
If you weren't old enough for school, you went to what Svein called a kind of kindergarten, but it sounds more like a place to park the kids while the adults worked, maybe get them doing simple tasks too.
The adults who were there, the men, told their own story. Only essential workers, leaders, blacksmiths.
Or the severely war-wounded. Men missing limbs. Even the animals were marked by the war. The horses used for work were often war-damaged horses sent there from the front.
Everything was recycled into the war effort, or the effort to survive behind the lines.
Even education was shaped by this reality. The Norwegian kids had to walk 3 kilometers just to get to the Russian school.
3 kilometers each way. And the first thing they learned.
Predictably, perhaps. Swear words from the local Russian kids. Svein laughs about it, but it paints a picture of the environment.
Schooling itself was erratic, not consistent.
No, Svein mentions a cycle like 14 days on, then 14 days off. Probably reflecting labor needs on the farm or teacher availability. Total chaos, really.
He picked up Russian quickly, apparently. Easy learner. His older brother, Palmer, found it harder.
But it's the specific anecdotes, the unforgettable details that really bring this time to life, like the incident with the horses.
Ah, yes, the war-injured horses they had to take to pasture. Palmer was riding a white stallion.
And some local kid deliberately spooked it just as Palmer was taking the bridle off. Horse freaked out. Palmer got thrown or hit. A really bad head injury, lots of bleeding.
They had to carry him all the way back. Just shows how danger was everywhere, even in seemingly routine chores.
And then there was the environment itself, the cold. We can't really comprehend it.
Inland Russia. Shadrinsk winters. He calls it store frost, deep frost. Temperatures hitting -30, even -40 Celsius.
Yeah, that's unimaginably cold.
He describes walking to school, the kids arriving with their faces just covered in ice like frost masks, looking like they'd walked back from the North Pole. It wasn't just cold, it was dangerous cold.
But maybe worse than the cold, or at least more constant, were the living conditions indoors. The vermin.
Oh, this part is just stomach churning. Stein's description is incredibly vivid.
Mice everywhere, constantly, and insects. He says if you looked closely at the walls in daylight, they looked like they were living, just crawling.
And lifting your pillow. Covered in cockroaches, bed bugs, it sounds like an absolute nightmare. Not just unpleasant, but a constant physical torment.
They tried everything. Tried burning the bugs out, which sounds dangerous in itself. Tried sleeping outside, but it was no use.
It got so bad, apparently, that the Russians eventually had to bring in people to properly disinfect the whole camp. That tells you how extreme it must have been, even by wartime Soviet standards.
And this constant struggle for basic hygiene, basic survival, it leads to probably the most shocking story in the whole account, the incident with Svein's foot.
Right. He was out picking pine cones, probably for fuel, cut his foot somehow.
And the blood immediately attracted ants, swarms of them. Before he knew what was happening, a group of Russian kids gathered around him.
And they just urinated on his foot. All of them.
It sounds horrifying. But Svein, looking back as an adult, explains it very pragmatically.
He says it worked. It cleaned the wound, the ants disappeared. And he rationalizes it, saying, urine is clean since it has gone through the kidneys.
It's such a stark moment. It shows this collision of cultures, but also the absolute pragmatism of survival. When you have nothing else, you use what's available, no matter how shocking it seems from the outside. Folk medicine, born of pure necessity.
A lesson you'd never forget. It really shows how quickly norms change when you're pushed to the absolute limit.
One other detail from Shadrinsk, the pioneer camp, like a Soviet youth camp. Svein's brother Palmer, who seemed to struggle more with adapting.
He ran away from it, tried to walk back, a long way. Svein actually found him asleep in a potato field.
But Svein himself, when he was sent later, he actually quite enjoyed it. He mentions picking berries, mushrooms in the forest. Maybe that structure, that outdoor activity, suited him better.
5 years. 5 years of this life, and then suddenly the war ends. 1945.
But getting home wasn't simple either. It was another managed process, another journey dictated by the Soviet state, and then by the realities of post-war Norway.
First, the Norwegian families were gathered up again, put on trains back towards Arkhangelsk, but they weren't immediately sent back to Norway.
No, there was this intermediate stage. Svein calls it the fattening up period.
Sounds odd, but it makes sense. They were kept somewhere for 3 or 4 weeks specifically to be fed, because they were basically starving, emaciated, after years of hard labor and minimal rations.
They had to be brought back to some level of physical health before being returned to a Western ally. It was almost a bureaucratic requirement.
Once they were deemed, well, presentable enough, they were moved to Murmansk. A Norwegian cargo ship picked them up there.
And on that ship, they got their first real taste of abundance, post-war abundance.
This ship was loaded with corned beef. And after years where every scrap of food mattered, they were told, eat as much as you want.
Can you imagine? The shock of it, unlimited food, especially something like meat, must have been overwhelming.
So they sailed across the Barents Sea back to Norway, landed in Tromsø first, stayed there about 2 weeks, waiting for onward travel.
And here's another sign of how much they'd changed or how much time had passed. The local kids in Tromsø, Norwegian kids, they saw these returning families.
And thought they were Russian. Because of how they looked. Maybe how they spoke after years away, the kids speaking Russian.
It shows that gap already. They were Norwegians who had been through this intense Soviet experience. They were already, in a way, foreigners returning home.
Finally, they got passage on a ship heading east, back towards Vardø, near Keenberg. But even that last leg was dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. The coastal waters were still full of mines, shipwrecks from the war. The captain apparently took a huge risk sailing through there.
But they made it. Arrived in Vardø to horn music playing on the quay. A moment of celebration.
Followed immediately by the devastating reality of what the Germans had done. Scorched earth.
Vardø was almost completely flattened. Svein says they were housed in the community center because it and the church were basically the only buildings left standing.
Just utter destruction. A few days later, they were ferried the last short distance back to their home village, Keenberg.
And the reception there, despite the ruin, was overwhelming. He says nearly the whole town came out. Describes it very honestly as just tears and snot.
A massive emotional release after 5 years of fear, separation, and the unknown.
But the joy of return was immediately tempered by loss. Their own house. Burned to the ground by the Germans. They had nowhere to live. Had to move in temporarily with an aunt's mother.
And the trauma, especially the loss of the father, the uncertainty, it hit the mother incredibly hard. She struggled to cope.
Yeah, the family unit, which had survived the physical journey, started to break apart under the psychological strain back home.
The mother ended up sending Palmer, the older brother, away to live in Wiens in Sweden.
And eventually Svein himself was sent away too, to live with his Aunt Elna in Strømstad. The family that left Keenberg together was effectively shattered by the war's end.
Which brings us full circle, back to that initial separation, back to the enduring mystery. What actually happened to Svein's father, the Oldefar, the partisan?
For years after the war, nothing. Just silence from the Soviet Union.
8 long years of waiting, of not knowing.
Until 1954. And the timing is poignant. Svein had joined the Norwegian military the year before, 1953. He was actually serving as a border guard.
Right on that same border, his father had been forced to cross nearly 14 years earlier.
When the official notification finally arrived from Russia, the death notice.
The official document stated he died in 1953, cause of death, meningitis.
Meningitis. But that official story immediately clashed with what the family suspected and with the rumors that had swirled for years.
This is the absolute core of their post-war trauma, isn't it? The official state narrative versus the lived reality of rumor and suspicion.
Svein is very clear. He says he believes his father was shot. There were stories, official hints maybe, that his father had behaved irregularly as a partisan back in Norway.
Maybe got too close to the local population, maybe deserted his post. It's vague, but hints of disciplinary action.
But the persistent rumor was much darker, much more aligned with, well, Stalinist justice.
The rumor was that he'd been sentenced 10 years hard labor in the salt mines, Siberia.
Svein himself acknowledges the confusion. He says, I don't know the truth, and points out there were just many lies and rumors at the time. You can feel the frustration, the lack of closure.
And that 8-year delay in notification is critical. Norway actively searched for its missing citizens after 45. But getting answers from the USSR, especially about people conscripted into sensitive roles like partisans, it was incredibly difficult. maybe impossible.
The source note some people declared dead did eventually turn up, years later, 9, 10 years after the war. But others, like Svein's father,
vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions.
So the war didn't really end for them in 1945. It just mutated into this enduring uncertainty, this corrosive doubt that destroyed family connections. The article ends on that note, reflecting on how hearing this story made the grandchild feel richer in knowledge.
Which is a powerful point. It shows that this kind of history, told through the personal lens, through the trauma and the details of survival, is what connects younger generations to the past, not just dates and battles.
Absolutely. This deep dive, for me, really moved us beyond the standard WWII narrative into this very specific, incredibly tough experience of Norwegian civilians caught between giants, mobilized, used, and in some cases, seemingly discarded by the Soviet system they fled to.
And the lifelong shadow cast by that first separation, by the father's unknown fate, it's palpable throughout the entire account.
What really stays with me is that conflict we just discussed. The official death certificate saying meningitis arriving 8 years late.
Versus the family's gut feeling, the rumors of Siberia, the belief he was executed. How do you reconcile those, especially against the backdrop of the Cold War, where truth from the East was always suspect?
It leaves us with a final thought, really. Something for you, the listener, to think about. When the official state record arrives decades late, offering a neat, perhaps convenient explanation,
how does a family ever square that with their own deeply held beliefs, with the persistent whispers and rumors that surrounded their loved one's disappearance? What is the real story, the final truth, for those who were declared scoreless, vanished without a...
Thank you for listening to Barske Studio True Crime. The story you've heard is just one of many hidden in the shadows of Nordic history. We release new episodes every week, exploring fresh true stories, from haunting mysteries to chilling crimes. Subscribe and join us next week as we uncover another untold truth. This was Barske Studio True Crime, told by AI with no emotion and no filter.